Once a month, I look forward to talking, schedules permitting, with Professor Richard Wolff. You should know him if you're a regular viewer of this program or a regular participant in the left conversation, because he is a vital contributor to that conversation. I've been learning from him for many years. He's Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's currently a visiting professor in the Graduate Program of International Affairs at the New School University in New York. He's host of the program Economic Update on Free Speech TV, which airs every Tuesday from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, and he's the founder of DemocracyAtWork.info, all of which you should check out. But so first of all, Richard Wolff, once again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoy our conversations.
As do I. And there are always a million things I want to talk to you about. And in a world that's just riven with challenges to democracy, challenges to the survivability of the planet, challenges to what remains of, our tattered freedoms, sometimes the strangest things stick in my mind, and I don't know if they're representative of these broader issues or I'm just getting off on a track. But during the course of the month, I sometimes think, well, I'd really like to talk to Richard Wolff about that. So one of them, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, but one of them was, I saw an article in the New York Times, maybe a week, maybe 3-4 days ago, and I've got it in front of me now. How much is a view worth in Manhattan? Try $11 million. Now, those of us who have been New Yorkers know that over the last number of decades, visibility, exposure to the sky, exposure to the sun seems to have become a commodity that's been traded away for the top 1% of the top 1% of the top 1%. It's loftier and loftier. Skyscrapers are built as we see different areas of town, areas that some of us lived in because nobody dared go in them, it seemed, now become choice residential real estate. And part of that is the sky gets blotted out and so on. Now, this article is about a loft building in Chelsea and how this guy, the owners of this loft building, to make sure they continued to have a view, they bought the air rights away from a neighboring lot. They basically said, the view of the sky that's afforded, that the absence of a tall building here affords, has monetary value. The owner of that lot got $11 million to own the air rights, meaning, I guess, that a tall building can't occupy that air. And my first thought was, what has gone so haywire with our sense of the public commons, a sense that, I think of from history going back to the English revolts of the diggers and so on, when the actual commons were being fenced and staked by the wealthy and powerful and aristocratic classes. What is going on with our world? Is this just, that's just the way the world works? Or is this a signifier of something unhinged about our economy and our way of doing things? And I really would like your perspective on that.
Well, I'm pretty sure I agree with the last conclusion that you basically reached. I really couldn't agree more. It is not necessary, it is not inevitable, but it is definitely how capitalism works. It comes into the world enclosing the commons, as you rightly mentioned, transforming the shared grazing land that all the peasants in a village could put their respective cows and horses on, carved it up into private property. And remember, all that private property is a law. It's never created by anything other than a law, which is, by the way, why for the most history of the human race, we didn't have private property, because it struck people as crazy. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church, which was the dominant church at the time, declared that private property was an offense against God, particularly when it had to do with land. And the argument of the church at the time was simple. Human beings didn't put that earth there. They didn't create the land. God did. And for human beings to think they own it is a kind of blasphemy against the way the world works. That's a religious way of saying, look, it's everybody's, but it's no particular person's. And if we're going to make decisions about how to use the common property, the common land, the common water, for example, then we have to make a democratic decision. We all have to be involved. What private property does is remove something valuable from the community and make it the private determination of an individual. And with land, it has always been fought because of this basic reality. If a piece of land belongs to everybody, it will be used for everybody. But if it becomes the private property of an individual, that individual, because this is all that private property law ever means, has the right to refuse its being used by the community of which that individual is a part. So that if the community needs the land, for example, to grow the food without which it can't survive, the individual, being a private owner, can withhold the land no matter what its need by the community. And on that basis, typically, the private owner extracts a rent, makes the community pay for what this individual has acquired as private property. And you're quite right, Richard, that periodically people have revolted. For example, if a handful of owners withhold enough land and everybody's starving, at a certain point, that's not a sustainable arrangement in the community. And typically something very unpleasant happens to those private owners. All you have in that story in New York City is that what happened to the land when when capitalism comes into existence is now happening, amazingly, literally, to the air we all once thought was our communal inheritance, our community resource, our value for us all to share, since we need to breathe and we need to see and we need to have access to the oxygen in the air, etc. This deal is the logic of capitalism. The people in that building who together forked over $11 million to buy the air rights want to control the air so that nobody else can do anything unless they give permission. They obviously were advised, I mean, I wasn't there personally, but by inference, you can draw that they were advised, A, that these air rights would become more valuable as Chelsea neighborhood gets built up more and more. Therefore, their 11 million outlay now will come back as more a year or 2 or 5 from now. And they were also probably told that if they didn't do that and an obscuring building was built, the values that they've already poured into their property would diminish. With these two arguments, both of which are crazy but logical in capitalism, you had that transaction which the New York Times recorded. But it is a sorry comment on the kind of lunacy of destroying the collective community resources. You know, I'm reminded that 2 or 3 years ago, the current dictator in Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, basically signaled the end of his power when he decided with a group of builders to take the last remaining public park in the middle of Istanbul and convert it from the common park all residents could enjoy into a building saga. I'm reminded as well of Central Park, major parts of which are now in the shadow. People who want to enjoy the park haven't got the sunlight they want because wealthy people built their tall buildings for their expensive penthouses without any regard for the rest of the community, literally as if they lived in a world all by themselves. That kind of selfishness, of egotism, of asocial or antisocial behavior is the product of the logic of a capitalist system and is one of the reasons folks like me are critical of it.
And it also, what brings to mind, what comes to mind, or came to mind during your last comments was Zuccotti Park, which used to be a public park, was given over to private developers with the promise that it would remain accessible to the public. That's where Occupy Wall Street started. But when the Occupy movement became too much of a pain in the neck for the authorities, they were cleared out of there. And one of the excuses given, if I recall correctly, and I think I do, is that, well, this is private property. So we get to, so in other words, the public square had become private, and then the fact that it was private was used to shut down public access and public speech. And it is a kind of red in tooth and claw quality about the capitalism at work here, where you have some people building tall buildings that hurt other people that have invested their capital, as you point out, for example, in this loft co-op. So you have one set of investors hurting another set of investors. In this case, the potentially victimized investors protect themselves by purchasing the quality, but who gets left out of it? Everybody else, everybody who,
Exactly.
the vast majority of us who don't have the ready cash to buy a loft in Chelsea right now.
Absolutely. By the way, I live in Chelsea, so I am only literally a few blocks from that. And to give you an idea of how this works, let me tell you a story about my street. On my street, all the buildings, until recently, including my own, were about 6 stories high. They were not allowed to go higher. Then a deal was made. A local school, a religious school, I won't mention which one, had a church there and a school related to the church, a private religious school, and they occupied a building, had for many decades, and they were approached by a real estate builder who purchased the air rights above their building. He cut a deal with them. He would give them 2 or 3 floors of a 35-story building. The rest would be very expensive condos, but he needed the church. Not only did he give them 2 or 3 floors for their school, but he also needed the church and its parishioners to put pressure on the local politicians to give him the variance that would allow him to build an immense taller building than any of the other buildings around it. So that was a deal. And so the private property, in this case owned by the church, cut a deal with the private property real estate developer. And therefore we now had in the middle of our block an immense new building, completely overshadowing other parts of the street, introducing traffic problems, pedestrian problems, parking problems, none of which these 2 entities had to care about or deal with or cope with, simply because there's profit in it and everybody else lives with the consequences but has no effective input into the process. It is the opposite of democracy.
Well, they say the Lord helps those who help themselves. And the fact is, in this case, we probably shouldn't go into the long and complex history of religious institutions and their relationship to capitalism, but do you imagine a way out of this? In other words, maybe we'll have someday a full socialist revolution and private property of this kind will be abolished. But short of that, I mean, things existed in a better stasis at one point. My grandfather was a tailor his whole life, on a tailor's income, raised a family in one of those, now highly sought after 3-bedroom pre-war apartments on the Upper West Side. And he could do that on a tailor's salary. In other words, there was there were slumlords, there were awful capitalist things going on in the state of New York, but New York City seems to me to be an example of so many of our world's cities now, London being, I think, even worse, where they are now exclusively the provenance of extreme capital accumulation. Is there a way out of this short of a massive revolution in the way we think and behave? Or is there just, do you think, an irreversibility, a kind of black hole quality, this accumulation of wealth that it can't be stopped?
No, I don't think it's an accumulation that can't be stopped. And the reason I think it can be stopped, at least temporarily, and I'll explain that in a minute, is because we've already done that. If you look at the distribution of wealth and income in the decades from the end of the Civil War in the United States to the great crash of 1929, it's a pretty grim story of ever-growing distance between rich and poor. We had millions of poor immigrants, some of the poorest in the world, coming in those days mostly from Europe to the United States to escape even worse conditions in the countries from which they came. But they arrived with nothing at the same time that you had the explosive industrialization of the United States. So on the one hand, you had desperately poor immigrants living in those tenements that you can visit on the Lower East Side of New York. And on the other hand, you had the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers amassing wealth beyond all count. And that eventually collapsed in on itself. That's what the 1929 crash was all about. And in the years that followed, the 1930s, things were demanded by the mass of people that the people who run this society could not afford to deny. Mr. Roosevelt, the president at the time, basically went to the rich people and the corporate leaders and said, you better give me the money to give back to the mass of the American people part of what has been taken from them, or else you're going to have a revolution and you won't be left with anything to give anybody. And he scared them, as he himself had been scared by what was going on. And then here's what happened. Across the 1930s, we radically altered, we reversed the redistribution of wealth of the previous 70 years. Instead of wealth being redistributed from the bottom and the middle to the top, we did exactly the opposite. We redistributed it back down to the middle and the poor. Not 100%, not completely, but so dramatically that if you look at the distribution of wealth and income in the United States, it got more and more unequal until the crash. And during the 1930s and into the 40s and even the 50s, it was much less unequal. That is, an upsurge from below, not a revolution, but an upsurge from below was able for decades, the 30s, the 40s, into the 50s, to reverse all of that. So that can happen. If you ask me the other question, can you make it durable? Then I think you have to, if not a revolution, you have to have a sustained, organized pressure from below that cannot be denied. Last point. The laws already exist. You don't need to change the law. Let me give you an example here in New York, and it's true in every city. There is something called the law of eminent domain.
Right.
And the way that law works is it allows a municipal authority, for example, by the way, it allows it for the state authorities too, but take a municipal authority like the government of the city of New York. They can determine, and it's up to them, they're not answerable to anybody. They can determine that there is something, some piece of land, some piece of property, some building that is now something that the community's welfare requires. That's all they have to show. And then they can force, that's the law, they can force whoever owns that piece of land or property to sell it at its current market value to the city, which then becomes the owner and can put it to the use it has found appropriate for the welfare of the community as a whole. That would have allowed, had we a different mayor, had we a different local politics, had we a real movement from below in New York, that could have been an intervention that said to both sides of that dispute in Chelsea, this is over, ladies and gentlemen. You're not going to decide this. Because if you persist in having a conversation, let alone imagining you're going to take that property, we will beat you to it. We will take it. And we will declare that we need it not only for a public park or a playground or a school or 100 other uses like a public garden, but we will declare part of our reasoning is we don't want the air that we all share and breathe to be determined for its uses by individuals who happen to be rich. That's not an acceptable way to, all of that exists. If we had the political pressure from below, our leaders would be using that law of eminent domain. And I could give you 50 other examples where people like us in the past pushed hard to get the laws on the books, to get the regulations, to make a precedent for these things. A lot of that exists. And a creative, or to be more honest, a politically self-aware movement of the people would have available many of the tools to change the direction of what's going on, just like a different political system would impose taxes in a radically different way so that it would be better for the cohesion of the community to tax people more progressively than we now do.
And it would be a means of designing the community you want to have, which is not a community of the wealthy, by the wealthy, for the wealthy, but a community, a New York.
Democratic, that's right.
Right,
A democratically designed community. I mean,
right.
I am always blown away here in the United States. We have these obligatory professions of commitment to democracy by every Tom, Dick, Harry, Mary, and Joanne. And yet, the most basic democratic decisions, most of the same people permit to be made other than democratically. Whether it's inside the workplace, where some dictatorial board of directors tells you everything what to do and then to go home, or whether it is in this situation that you allow wealthy private individuals literally to control the land of the community and the air, neither of which they produce and neither of which they ought to be entitled to use for their own personal benefit.
I'm imagining a New York City where it was actually a matter of public debate that if you're a fishmonger, let's say, and you work at the Fulton Fish Market, should you be able to see the sky as you walk from the nearest subway station, let's say coming over from Brooklyn, or should we allow the unrestrained construction that's going to block out most of the sky? Or for that matter, I'm thinking of your mayor, the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, saying the other day after these blackouts, and you have the same thing in California, you have power utilities working for the interests of the few and not the many, but saying all of a sudden, maybe we should take over the power company and make it a public utility, as many of them used to be, and make it work for the people's interests. And I thought, well, where's this Bill de Blasio been? You know, this guy is making sense. So public utilities.
Your example of California, pardon me for interrupting,
Sure.
but your example in California is in a way even stark. The failure of the Con Edison Corporation. I live here in Manhattan. For the last week, every day we get robot calls, those of us who live here in New York, from Con Edison, with a robot giving us roughly the following message. It is going to be very hot over the next few days. This bolt from the blue isn't necessary, but they begin with that.
Thank you, Nostradamus. Yeah, right.
Therefore, here comes the hard part. Therefore, there may be electrical outages. You may not be able to count on the electricity. And we urge you, especially if you have medical conditions, to take appropriate action. In other words, we can't do what you pay us to do. Con Ed has some of the highest electric rates in the United States. And it is telling us that they hope we don't die from the failure of them to provide us with electricity. I mean, that's it. The conversation at that point ought to be over. Like in California, where the PG&E Corporation, the utility there, has basically admitted that to be more profitable, to save on costs, they did not take care of forest land that ended up burning and destroying whole communities, for which they are being held legally liable now. But it's a little bit late in the day for all of this. Many countries have nationalized or socialized their utilities, their transportation systems, their banks, precisely and almost always because leaving them in the hands of private profit meant that sooner or later that private profit would be given higher priority than the social dependence of all of us on that enterprise. And that's not only undemocratic, that's stupid, that's self-destructive. That helps only the tiny number of people who own these enterprises and sacrifices all the rest of us.
You know, that gets to another issue that, and there were a million I wanted to talk about with you, Professor Richard Wolff, but it gets to another subject. I noticed on your own show, on Economic Update, you interviewed a Democratic Socialist politician, Lee Carter from Virginia.
Right.
And I've been pondering this question a lot. I haven't even really talked about it publicly, but I get asked, am I personally a socialist? And the answer is yeah, in a lot of ways, I guess. I mean, I don't see that, but socialism is a very broad umbrella, as you know better than I. So I don't necessarily, I don't think we need to nationalize clothing retail. I don't think every Nine West store needs to be a government. I think that's fine if entrepreneurs want to go into certain lines of business. But I think that a lot more of the economy should be public than is currently public today, and a significantly lower amount of the economy should be privately held than is privately held today. So I guess that makes me a socialist or democratic socialist or whatever you want. I think the government should provide health care. I think the government should provide public utilities. I think water should be freely available to everyone. I mean, I could go down the list. But
if I could comment on that first point you made about when people ask you if you're a socialist, let me give you a parallel, because that kind of thing, and you answered it well, but that kind of thing gets me angry. If someone asks you, are you a Christian? Mm-hmm. Do you have to say, yeah, well, maybe, but I'm not in favor of the Spanish Inquisition, or I'm not in favor of the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages, when Christians on both sides slaughtered each other while listening to clerics, all of whom were Christians, egging them on and telling them that God preferred their side over the other side, while the cleric on the other side said the same thing in reverse? Or should I say to them, are you in favor of missionaries coming in as the advance guard when Christian imperialists and colonialists took over Asia, Africa? In other words, I can ask them whether they're interested in Christianity or feel themselves to be Christian without expecting a litany of apologies and excuses for the things that have been done in the name of Christianity that are awful. Socialism has things that were done in its name that are awful. That's true. I wish it weren't true. But you know something? It's true of every major religion, and it's true of many large social movements. And it's a little bit childish to act as though there's some peculiar quality of socialism that makes it appropriate to think otherwise, and then to give a free pass to all the other religions and social movements that have at least as much to apologize for as socialists do.
Well, and I guess you could invert it too. And when a politician says, as I think Elizabeth Warren felt compelled to explain, I am a capitalist, I'm all for markets. I guess she didn't feel compelled to say, although it's clear her record's been very good in terms of regulation and all that, except when they go crazy and do horrific things to people and expel the disabled and the elderly from their homes and on and on. So your point is well taken. And I wasn't really trying to do that. What I was trying to do was to say, I'm socialist about a lot of things.
Right.
And there are other things where maybe I'm not, because I think it's okay to open a clothing boutique or whatever.
Absolutely.
So
When I taught this in school, and I would explain that there are some kinds of socialism that want the government to play a major role, to own and operate enterprises and so on. My students, in all honesty and innocence, would say, you mean they wouldn't have private property? And I said, yes, they wouldn't have private property. And then they would look at me with some alarm. What about my radio? What about my toothbrush?
Right.
What about my shoes? And I would have to explain, no. They don't mean private property in terms of your personal consumer items. They mean it in terms of the means of production. And then I would go through the explanation. But you could see that they had grown up in an intellectual or ideological universe in which they had been deeply trained without even knowing it to think in certain ways that make socialism either dangerous or ridiculous or confused. There's a lot of work to do. That's why I'm so amazed that the latest polls, Gallup and other polls, indicate that particularly for people under 35 in the United States, half of them think socialism would be a better future for the United States than the capitalism they're living through.
And they might have a point, the inverse of that, by the way, and then we should probably go, but we might, if we have time, record a few minutes of 5 minutes of post talk or something, but for the YouTube page. But when you go to Europe, as I've done and met with some of the socialist parties over there, my problem is they're like centrist Democrats.
That's right.
So the label socialist there not only doesn't carry the charge it does here, but apparently leaves a lot of ideological wiggle room to work with the IMF or whomever. But unfortunately, I guess we're going to have to leave it there. So as always, Professor Richard Wolff, wonderful to talk to you. And again, I would urge viewers and listeners to check out Economic Update and Democracy, which is on Free Speech TV and is a podcast, and also to check out DemocracyAtWork.info. So Professor Richard Wolff, as always, a pleasure talking to you.
Same here, and I look forward to our next time.